representatives, Your Excellency, the Minister of Justice and Public Order, esteemed First Lady, Mrs. Kartsera Christodoulidis, distinguished guests. It's a real pleasure to have you all joining us here today. That makes our voice stronger. A plenary hall full with women who leave their marks in politics, in diplomacy, and in the civil society. I can see a man among us. He's a member of the Human Rights Committee. Okay. It feels so good to be hosting this discussion as the chair of the Standing Committee on Human Rights and as vice president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization and Security in Europe. We are joined by representatives of the government, parliamentarians, ambassadors, members of the diplomatic corps, the civil society. Women in peace and security, from theory to practice. Almost a quarter of a century ago, the adoption of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 marked a turning point. From that point on, women, like the ones sitting in this room today, have turned it into practice. It's all about you. You did it. And none of the piles of resolutions of international organizations on this subject would matter if you hadn't done it yourself. Someone would assume there is widespread consensus on the participation of women in international peace and security. On the ground, the situation is quite slow to progress. The reason is simple. Women's participation in security, above all, is a question of power. And nobody wants to share power, especially when patriarchal stereotypes prevail. Therefore, I am honored to host more than 70 women leading in peace and security, practicing what others preach. As Vice President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, I have submitted amendments that have changed the rules of procedure so that the need for gender equal representation in the OSCPA is taken into consideration when appointing officials of the Assembly. Today, I do not just talk about women in peace and security. It is time to talk and discuss with you all who have a leading role on such important political issues. Dear friends, if I may, dear sisters, the geopolitical sands are shifting. Middle East is on fire. Security is undermined. We are far from seeing the end of it yet. Our entire region is threatened. Insecurity is becoming the norm, and Middle East is not the only unstable region at the moment. The Russian invasion in Ukraine is not making headlines these days, although it continues to pose a threat for global security. European Union member states might have acted upon principles sanctioning Russia, but at the same time, because of that, they are suffering severe economic consequences as a result. Furthermore, the situation in Armenia and Azerbaijan throws South Caucasus into instability, and I see nothing but stagnation in the Cyprus problem. And in this geopolitical vortex, the massacre of 7th October, the Hamas brutal terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians have destabilized the entire Mediterranean region. The Eastern Mediterranean remains a region where major actors have compelling strategic, security, and economic interests. At the moment, the Mediterranean Sea is seeing unprecedented military concentration. Turkey is seeking another role, and I'm referring to the latest statements of President Erdogan to present himself as the protector of Muslim world, justifying crimes that have shaken the world. His efforts aim to maintain his revisionist aspirations and he seeks to exercise his influence apart from the Mediterranean in the Arabian Peninsula, in South Caucasus, in Central Asia, and beyond. Against this perfect storm, the role of women is of utmost importance. Women in peace and security begets the question, what about women in war? What about women in insecurity and instability? How can they contribute? How do they approach such important issues? What gives them a distinct approach? I very much look forward and count on your inputs, both in this discussion and most importantly, in your fields of expertise. I am positive that our keynote speakers will have a lot to say about these issues, and I look forward to hear their perspective. Thank you.
Please allow me to speak in Greek. For a bit, I would like to inform you that there is interpretation from Greek into English and vice versa. I would like to inform you that our meeting is broadcast live on the YouTube channel of the House of Representatives and also on the House website. So I have said we have interpretation into English and into Greek. So I would like to ask any of you who would like to intervene to fill out the relevant form in your folder, and in about 10 minutes, a member of our staff will pass by to collect the forms. I have spoken in English. I continued in Greek, and now please allow me to go back to English because I would like to lift any obstacles to our communication, at least for the majority of our guests who are foreign speakers. Our aim is to find ways to communicate efficiently, honestly, and in a targeted manner.
Her Excellency, the President of the House of Representatives, Mrs. Anita Dimitriou, the first female President of the House of Representatives. Madam President, you have the floor for 4 minutes. Thank you.
Dear First Lady of the Republic of Cyprus, Mrs. Philippa Karissera-Christodoulidis, dear Minister of Justice and Public of the Cyprus Republic, Anna Kokidis Prokopiou, President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization of Security and Cooperation, Ambassador of France, Mrs. Elena Rafti, members of the Parliament, ambassadors, ministers, ex-ministers, commissioners, representatives of the religious groups, former Commissioner, welcome, esteemed guests, dear friends. Let me begin by expressing my great pleasure and satisfaction at the sign of a plenary session, of a plenary hall, full of women leaders in politics, diplomacy, and activism. I wish to warmly welcome you all at the House of Representatives and to congratulate you, the chairperson especially, of the House Standing Committee on Human Rights and Equal Opportunities for Men and Women and Vice President of OASE Parliamentary Assembly, Mrs. Irini Charalambidis, for this excellent initiative to organize this event. And Irini, thank you so much for everything you are doing to support all of us in the end of the day. The truth is that there is progress, albeit slow in terms of more women being engaged in security and peace-related matters and processes. This is a very positive development that we must feel proud of, while realizing at the same time that progress is not just meant to happen, but is the result of decades of hard, often frustrating work. The question remains, are we doing enough? Today's discussion can bring visibility for women that lead in politics, in diplomacy, and in civil society. And visibility is much needed to encourage more women and girls to engage. Let us not forget that we are having the forthcoming European elections in a couple of months. Because you can't be what you cannot see. Dear guests, currently there are numerous regional conflicts. How do we respond? What is the impact on women and what is the impact of women? The impact on women is devastating. Conflicts amplify gender inequality, poverty, and the victimization of women. What we are witnessing is devastating in Ukraine, correctly mentioned from the President Irini Charalambidis in Nagorno-Karabakh, and of course more recently in our neighborhood. What we see in Israel and Gaza is terrifying. Terrorism cannot be justified, full stop. Atrocities against children and women cannot be tolerated under any circumstances. Standing resolutely against terrorism and doing everything possible to alleviate the humanitarian costs cannot be mutually exclusive. Even more needs to be done to protect civilian lives, and Cyprus is doing its fair share in this regard. Cyprus is fully aware of the consequences of armed conflicts for women and girls. Sexual violence was used as a weapon of war during the Turkish invasion back in 1974. Cypriot women were raped, tortured, humiliated, and many of them brutally murdered. And while we know that for every woman who reports these horrific crimes, there are many more who remain silent. I'm somehow sometimes relieved that these women were found the courage to report their rapes and are now supported after intense efforts of the House of Representatives led by women committee chairs in close cooperation, of course, with a woman minister. Cypriot women shoulder a great burden in the aftermath of the Turkish invasion, as is everywhere the case in efforts to restore the social fabric and destroy the economy of the country. And yet Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot women's organizations have had a significant contribution to the efforts for reapproachment between the two communities, for reunification and peace in Cyprus. The effective participation of women in peace processes as provided for in Resolution 1325 in terms of their participation in mediation activities and decision-making is essential. Women's insight and perspective are essential, and their analyses are indispensable to understand the dynamics of conflicts and to develop effective prevention and intervention strategies. This is why the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is a priority. The Republic of Cyprus has set up a national action plan to reflect that and to build on that. This resolution is not only about breaking some glass ceiling. The world needs styling, it's what women can bring to the table. Pragmatism, progress, and this is what we need for the moment. Dear guests, the House of Representatives believes in and stands ready for initiatives and synergies, which will further increase women's visibility in peace and security, and will enhance the legislative work and the oversight process in this respect. I wish you fruitful deliberations in today's meeting and congratulate once more Mrs. Charalambidis for this initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Now I will give the floor to the First Lady, Mrs. Philippa Kartsera-Christodoulidis. It is well known, of course, that Mrs. Kartsera-Christodoulidis is a career diplomat. Please, you have the floor, Mrs. Christodoulidis.
Distinguished President of the House of Representatives, distinguished Chair of the Committee, Honorable Minister of Justice and Public Order, Your Excellency, ambassadors, distinguished guests, I have received with great interest and great pleasure the invitation of the Chair of the Standing Committee to take part in this discussion on women, peace and security. Firstly, I would like to thank and congratulate Mrs. Irini Charalambidou for the initiative, stressing that, in my opinion, the discussion of this issue with the participation of remarkable and competent women, especially at the House of Representatives, shows political maturity that is late, perhaps, but is powerful in conjunction with the program, with the governance program of my husband, Mr. Christodoulidis.
Esteemed guests, undoubtedly the world is facing deeply challenging times. Global threats such as armed conflict, climate change, hunger and poverty all jeopardize international peace and security. Stability and security are at great risk with significant effects to all groups of the population, particularly women, elderly and children. In fact, current developments in the Middle East, Cyprus' immediate neighborhood, are a shocking reminder of how rapidly humanitarian conditions can change and how vulnerable women remain. While I was preparing this intervention, I realized that almost 80 years have passed since the end of the Second World War and the genesis of three major landmarks in the evolvement of international human rights, namely the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and of course, the European Convention of Human Rights. While great women have played a crucial role and made significant contribution in all fields of policymaking in the world during all these decades, we are still, and we have to admit it, far away from equal representation when we refer to participation of women in politics, in decision-making bodies, in all spheres and fields, including international relations, peace and security. With UN Security Council Resolution 1325, in response to which the government is already implementing a national action plan coordinated by our Gender Commissioner, the UN is recognizing the role of women in prevention of conflicts, resolving and maintaining and rebuilding peace, stressing the pressing need that women should and must participate in peacekeeping operations. I'm here today to congratulate and support this initiative because I truly believe in what the previous head of the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, Under Secretary General Michelle Bachelet, stated, that wherever there is a conflict, women must be part of the solution. And as a diplomat, a mother of girls, and as a spouse of the President, I will support and stand with conviction behind any policy that aims to effectively promote equal rights, equal access, and equal opportunities. You can count on me, Madam President. Given that I am amongst such distinguished audience today, I want to take this opportunity to raise three main points. First, my deep belief that women have a major role to play in international relations, as well as political processes, in conflict resolution and peace building, in securing peace, security, and prosperity. I know it, I believe it, because I have seen it in practice. Women make up more than half of the population. More university graduates are women. They are educated, smart, capable, experienced, and they bring to the table a unique set of characteristics. They are practical, results-oriented, committed, effective, sensitive but sensible, with empathy and great sense of what is just, reasonable, and fair. Their multiple roles as daughters, mothers, partners, make them more focused on what is important, what is of true substance, and I believe more persistent in terms of problem solving. Women also have a moral compass, an instinct that guides them. When they know there is the correct path, that this is the right thing to do for the public interest, nothing will stop in trying. Secondly, women, wherever they are, whether in public or private business, they have a remarkable work ethic and they are great team players, knowing how to lead, but also how to give space to younger generations. Then why are the numbers so low when it comes to representation in high-level position in the international or national political positions. And this takes me to my third point. I served as career diplomat for 24 years, a male-dominated field, at least when I joined the ministry. Following 3 postings abroad and many demanding postings internally at the ministry or the presidential palace, as mother and spouse, what I can say is that we absolutely need more support so that women are enabled to lead. I agree, of course, that we must put in place effective mechanisms to ensure women's participation and representation in politics and political processes, preserving full and meaningful women involvement and leadership. However, these steps on their own will not solve the problem. Because women like me, and I guess like you, ladies, very often have to say no and reject positions in which we could thrive and serve our country meaningfully for very simple reasons. Because at the age of 40 to 50, when they have enough experience and still enough courage and energy to undertake difficult positions, they cannot ignore and leave behind their important roles and obligations derived by their roles as mothers, as daughters, as partners. Added to that, when women are at the outset of their career, normally at the ages between 25 and 35, they have to stay behind to raise their babies or exhaust themselves to be able to handle. Simply put, if we ever want to secure fair and equal participation of women in politics or in any other field, which will be tremendously valuable for the public interest, we must strive to create the conditions so that women, young and older, can advance in their careers in whatever they wish without being forced to abandon their role as mothers, daughters, and spouses, even temporarily. By the way, these roles are equally important for the society we want to have if we want to have a society based on the principles that mothers can pass to their children. So how we do this? Just like the other countries have already done it. And in this, the Parliament has an equal role to play together with the government. More nurseries and baby care centres, better schools and public transportation, good elderly care centres, safe playgrounds, and green towns, equal pay, more annual leave for mothers, flexible working methods, scholarships to young girls who are coming from low-income families. Only when we achieve all this will we see more women at the highest levels of public and private sectors and more happy women in politics, culture, in any field they wish. Last point. I'm encouraged and motivated by my husband's track record. As a foreign minister, he encouraged all capable women in the ministry with deeds, not just words, to pursue their dreams and accept high-level demanding positions. He appointed during his tenure more women directors in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or ambassadors abroad, sending the message that what matters is quality of work and nothing else, showing at the same time understanding when family affairs occurred. In his new capacity as president, he has appointed as ministers, deputy ministers, commissioners, directors at the presidential palace, more women than ever, and also women who are at a particular demanding phase of their life, women young enough to have young children who were to take on this difficult task. More than 41% of these officials are today women. This is important for yet another reason. These women are seen by younger ladies as positive role models. They inspire others to believe that if they can make it work, well, yes, they can do it as well. These steps, Madam Chairperson, dear guests, create optimism and that more capable women in more demanding high-level postings can thrive if they are enabled and given the opportunity to. We must not just create the culture of acceptance and reject the stereotypes about the women behind the men. No, we must above all create the conditions for women to compete male colleagues in equal terms. And then we will see also more women in politics and in peacekeeping and security as well. And I can humbly say that I have no doubt that this government has the political will and the courage to create these opportunities, these conditions for all women to pursue their real dreams. In achieving this common vision, the Parliament has, of course, a pivotal role to play. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και εύχομαι μια παραγωγική και επιτυχία.
Thank you very much. I wish you a fruitful discussion.
The message follows a 2-minute video by the President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCPA is the largest regional security organization under Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter. It focuses on security and peace. Gender equality is a basic premise. Therefore, we have another woman leading this institution, Mrs. Pia Kauma.
Dear Irene, fellow parliamentarians, thank you for inviting me to address this special meeting of the Standing Committee on Human Rights and Equal Opportunities for Men and Women. I'm sorry for not being able to join you in sunny Nicosia today, but I hope that my experience as a Finnish parliamentarian and as President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly can contribute to your discussions. As a Finn, I'm proud of my country's efforts to promote female engagement in politics and decision-making. The Finnish Parliament has long been one of the most progressive in the world. Today, 46% of our members are women. Our long-standing commitment to gender equality is illustrated by our successive national plans on women, peace and security, which are developed in close cooperation with civil society. In the OSCE as well, we share the strong conviction that the meaningful participation of women can help prevent and solve conflicts. I have no doubt that this will remain high on the OSCE's agenda when Finland takes over the chair in 2025. Within the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, we continue to promote the role of women. For many years, and despite the fact that women remain underrepresented, steps have been taken to ensure equal representation in positions of leadership. Today, thanks to a proposal by Vice President Irene Charalambidis, our rules now clearly say that gender balance must be taken into account in the various appointments made by the President. Sometimes we need to entrench these values to guarantee true progress towards greater gender equality in all spheres of life. We can do this in our parliaments by championing policies and laws which contribute to the women, peace and security agenda. But it also means that even though we should congratulate one another about what we have achieved in the past 2 decades, we must remain vigilant. We must continue to protect women, and we must continue paying attention to new threats to women's rights. And we must continue to build resilient partnerships to promote the role of women. I'm sure that your discussion today will identify areas where we can all work together towards these goals. Thank you.
I would like now to introduce our first keynote speaker, the esteemed Minister of Justice and Public Order, Mrs. Anna Koukidis-Prokopiou. Mrs. Prokopiou is also an international relations expert, so she has a very keen interest on security issues. Mrs. Prokopiou, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Kalimera.
Good morning.
Representatives, Madam Chair, esteemed First Lady, esteemed guests. When Irini asked me to take the floor today, and she said, try not to speak just as the Minister of Justice, I was a bit perplexed. because it's, once you represent an institution, it's quite difficult not to represent the institution. But then I couldn't escape from myself. So what you will hear today as my 2 cents of wisdom has to do as well with my previous position as an expert on women, peace and security agenda. So I will start by dedicating this session to some of my former colleagues who are now dead, because they have been working in the field. And I'm still part of the WhatsApp group of the UN Senior Women Talent Pipeline. And on the 1st of March, I said, ladies, I need to leave the group. And they said, no, you stay. You're one of us. And I get some very unfortunate news from that group. So I will start by dedicating this session to them, because being part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda on the field is dangerous. It's not easy. Then the second thing I would like to stress before I start is that I believe we need to dedicate this session as well to the women of Cyprus who have suffered quite a lot. When I first read the Fawcett report by the Council of Europe, by the legal expert James Fawcett, what I read, it's something that I cannot forget, because it describes very vividly the atrocities that women in Cyprus suffered in 1974. And I think we have this burden and this responsibility when we talk about the Women, Peace and Security agenda to remember that some of those women who suffered, who were raped, who were brutally attacked, are still alive, and they're still among us. And there is a responsibility to remember. And to remember not only just to vindicate them, but also to make sure the same things do not happen again to the younger generation. So I will start by saying the following. When we talk about women, peace, and security, the men will always correlate the women with the peace ingredient. And when we start talking about security, they will assume that their being male makes them more of an expert on security than makes us, that we're actually the experts. And it has happened to me many times that we're in a room full of men and they make this assumption. I've worked on security for the last, very, very specifically for the last 7 years, but any man, I'm telling you, they assume they know more about me than me on security because I'm a woman. Now, when we define security, there's some definition that I would like to bring to the table, and that's the notion of inclusive security. What is inclusive security? Inclusive security means that we take into consideration the security concerns of everyone in the room. Now, if there are no women in the room, their security considerations are not taken into perspective. Now, in the negotiations regarding the Cyprus problem, which is very close to home, many times I've quoted dear Minister Kozakou Markoulis when she said, I felt very lonely in that negotiation room because there were not many women around. And the question is not having the women around to take notes and do the donkey work, or some of them negotiate, as in the case of Minister Kozakou Markoulis, but the question is, are there any women making decisions? So I'm putting the question forward, and I'm glad that we've already adopted the National Action Plan concerning 1325, which commits the Cyprus government to making more women participate, to allowing more women participate in the Cyprus peace process, which is something that we have promised to the United Nations Secretary General as a pledge. And I'm glad that I see some of the women who participate in this process, or did participate in this process, in this room with us today. So what do women bring to the table? They bring their different security perceptions, different than the perceptions of men, different needs. In my capacity as an expert in my previous life, when I mapped out the perceptions of women regarding security, they were about very basic human needs. Will my kids be safe at school if there is a peace process concluded into a solution? Will I be able to walk safely back home at night without being attacked? Will there be racism prevalent post-solution in Cyprus? What about healthcare? What about social security? When we asked them the same questions, they said, oh, armies, guarantees. Women were concerned about those too, but they were also concerned about the basic survival needs of them and their kids, which is another important premise they bring to the table. We know that when we have more women involved in the peace process, the peace agreement lasts longer because it's more inclusive, it's more sustainable. And women have this tendency in managing risk differently than men. This is proven by scientific studies. We also know that women score higher on the emotional intelligence indicators, proven by many, many surveys. So we know that women are better negotiators than men, especially when they negotiate on behalf of others and not for their own personal gain. Proven. So do we need more women around the negotiating table? The answer is yes. Do we need more women in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly? And I've worked with OSCE in the past in a project on Turkmenistan. So the OSCE organization is an organization close to my heart. So do we need them? Yes, because we know by fact that when women are involved in the parliamentary process, they build consensus, they go across party lines, they are very much concerned about human rights violations, and they are very much concerned about the women issues that the men usually forget about. So, is it easy for women to be part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda? No, it is not. And I will just start by saying the following. There is conditionality attached to our very existence. We are always someone's something. We are the daughters and the mothers and the associates of others in many, many cases. And I will say the following, the Cyprus Constitution, unfortunately, is a contributor to the patriarchal structure that we are faced with. Because our existence as women in the Greek Cypriot community is exactly conditioned by the ethnic origin of the husband or the father, in our constitution. So if I marry a Turkish Cypriot man, I become a member of the Turkish Cypriot community. So the conditionality is there, maybe we don't think about it, but it structures the way that we are perceived and the way that we are allowed, because we're always allowed to enter the room. The room belongs to the men, and sometimes we're allowed to enter too. And I'm telling you from personal experience now that you're always judged by someone else's standards. And I know that time is running out, and there are other very esteemed speakers which will be taking the floor after me, and I know it's good to have questions posed. But I will leave you with something that a friend of mine who was very close to Hillary Clinton, she was part of her team, a funny story that she shared with me. So I was sitting there with Shelly, and we were exchanging stories, and she was telling me, you know, Hillary once went to this girls' graduation ceremony. And she was asked, what's the best advice that you can give me? One of the girls asked, and she said, you know, always make sure you get your hair done. Because she said, I was criticized because I had my hair up in a scrunchie. I don't know if you remember that story. She got out of the plane to go negotiate about something quite important, and the press was talking about her hair. She hadn't done her hair, and she had it put up. So why was she sharing that story? I was discussing this with my friend, and she said, obviously, she was making the point. You're judged differently. Always judged differently. So I don't want to end on that quite pessimistic note. What I want to end this intervention with is on a positive note, and the First Lady is here. I know I'm sure she adheres to what I will say because she's already mentioned it in her speech. President Christodoulidis has made a pledge to involve and encourage and engage women actively in the political process, and it is already happening. And we have a very active and First Lady who's had an exemplary career herself. So I'm sure that this pledge will also extend into the Cyprus peace process. Hopefully it will begin. We hope it begins, because there can be, we've been focusing on war and conflict too much. But I think it's time, from what we see going on around us in the region, to also focus on the peace and on getting things settled, rather than leaving them unsettled. Because frozen conflicts, as we've seen, they often erupt, and when they erupt violently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Protopiou, for a very insightful address and for mentioning the atrocities women of Cyprus suffered. And I do agree with you that we have an absolute different perspective from men on security issues. We move now to our next keynote speaker, Her Excellency, the Ambassador of France in Cyprus, Mrs. Salina Grenet-Catalano. France, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is playing a key role in the region and the world in general. Mrs. Grenet-Catalano has held various positions, including in the United Nations and other international organizations, and has served in various diplomatic posts, including in the Middle East. You have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, dear Anita, Madam First Lady, dear Filipa, Mrs. President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, Mrs. Vice President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, dear Irini, Minister of Justice and Public Order, dear Anna, Ministers, Members of Parliament, fellow ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, and Commissioner also, because I want to mention the very good work that your Commissioner is doing. Kalimera. I'm very pleased and very honored to participate and contribute to this debate dealing with very important issues this morning. The multiplication of current crises reminds us once again that we live in a more and more unstable world. Conflicts find their origins in different sources which can add up to each other. Socio-economic inequalities, tensions around natural resources, fights for territories, global warming are the crucible of suffering which women and girls are very often the primary victims. In conflict zones, but also in pacified regions, their place in society confronts them with difficulties and discriminations in all areas. And it is a reality that was further exacerbated by the pandemic. The issues that we are discussing today are more than ever topical. In the context of the horrendous conflict which is raging on our doorstep in the Middle East, I would also like to take this opportunity to send all my thoughts to the civilians affected by the Israel-Gaza crisis, and especially the women and children. As you know, the UN has been working for several decades now on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and the Resolution 1325, adopted in 2000, and 9 other resolutions adopted since then, have been implemented by all countries at a national level. In France, we are implementing our 3rd National Action Plan, which covers the period 2021-2025, and our plan is based on 3 pillars. First, prevention, by raising awareness. Second, protection of women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations. And 3, women's participation in peace processes. So our national plan was published on the occasion of the Equality Generation Forum, the most important global feminist gathering 25 years after the Beijing conference in 1995. I will come back to that conference later on. But France reiterates its support to the ongoing efforts of the United Nations to mainstream the Women, Peace and Security agenda at all levels, and especially in peace processes. We will continue to push for strong mandates and adequate resources for the concrete implementation of this agenda. For instance, we are mobilizing resources to implement our national plan and achieve our ambitions. And we have, as an example, contributed for 6.2 million euros between 2020 and 2022 to the Global Survivors Fund, launched in 2019 by Dr. Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad, Nobel Peace Prize laureates in 2018, for their efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and armed conflict. I would like to say a few words about Nadia Murad, because I had the chance to meet her several times in Paris. She's a very courageous woman, and she suffered persecution due to her religion, Yazidism, in 2014 during the Second Iraqi War. She was rescued, and she is now a Yazidi human rights activist and the UN Goodwill Ambassador for the dignity of victims of human trafficking. She was received several times by President Macron and by our successive ministers of foreign affairs. And Catherine Colonna, for instance, our current Minister of Foreign Affairs, has consulted her recently on the best way to address the needs of victims of sexual violences committed during Russia's war in Ukraine. Broadly, since his very first mandate back in 2017, President Macron has made gender equality and the realization of women's human rights a priority. This has led France to join a small group of countries which have adopted what we call a feminist diplomacy in 2019. What does it mean, a feminist diplomacy? It means a diplomacy which makes the defense and the promotion of the rights of women and girls one of the priorities of its action, and which integrates this priority into all areas of foreign policy. Women's rights are not optional values. They are universal human rights protected by international human rights law, and it's self-evident that the challenges that lie ahead of us, they won't be properly addressed without the full, equal, meaningful, and effective participation of women and girls in all respects. So our action is concrete. I will give you a few examples. We co-chaired with Mexico the conference, the forum that I mentioned previously, the Generation Equality Forum in 2021. And during this conference, $40 billion have been announced at the forum to enhance gender equality through a 5-year action plan. This forum epitomized what multilateralism in action can achieve. And France has fully honored its commitment, increasing its financial support for sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we have we have dedicated 400 million euros over the period 21-25 in this regard. And will continue to tirelessly defend the right of women to their bodily autonomy, as well as the recognition of the right to abortion as a fundamental right. By the way, I would like to tell you that following an initiative by President Macron, we are going to try to reform our constitution, to include the right to abortion into our constitution. So we'll be, if it's done, in the coming months, we'll probably be the first country to do that. Secondly, we have launched a support fund for feminist organizations of the Global South, which mobilized 120 million euros over 3 years. The idea is to fund the activities of feminist movements all around the world, and especially in low-income countries. This fund for feminist organization has supported up to now 1,000 associations in over 70 countries. And we strongly and systematically condemn the repression of demonstrations by very courageous women in Iran who are fighting for their freedoms, especially during the Women Life Freedom movement following the death of Mahsa Amini, a 20-year-old Iranian student who died 3 days after being arrested by the Iranian police for, I quote, wearing inappropriate clothing. So in October 22, about a month after her death, the city of Paris awarded her with the honorary citizenship. She was also posthumously awarded in December 2022 with the Franco-German Prize for Human Rights and the Rule of Law from the German and French Ministers of Foreign Affairs. And in 2023, she received the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought by the European Parliament. Those won't make her alive again, but it's a symbol and it's a demonstration of our moral support to Iranian women. Everything must be done to protect women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence and discrimination. This is why we call more and more countries to ratify the Istanbul Convention, and this is also why France and the Netherlands present every 2 years a resolution on efforts to prevent and eliminate all forms of violence against women at the UNGA. But to be able to implement an international, I'm very late, so I will really do quick. We need to set an example ourselves, and I would just like to give you a few figures about what we have tried to do within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have put in place measures to give female agents greater access to position of responsibility with personalized support and to encourage them to apply for senior position. Now, in the Quai d'Orsay, our Ministerial Executive Committee is for the first year and for the first time in history as a female majority for the first time. We have the number of female ambassadors has doubled in less than 10 years. So now we have reached almost 30% of ambassadors are female. We are aware that we still have a long way to go, but we are trying step by step to aim for professional equality. We humbly wish to encourage more countries to officially join the club of countries with a feminist diplomacy. In a word, feminist diplomacy strengthens diplomacy in general. And we strongly believe that our world will be more balanced, more harmonious, and more effective when there is real progress towards equal rights between men and women. And as the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Catherine Colonna, said last September in New York, we should all acquire the reflex of equality, which benefits everyone, and not only women. This is all the more important as we see that in many places the rights of women and girls are suffering a very worrying setback. And to resist this, women's participation in decision-making processes must be strengthened. This is why we encourage the appointment of a UN envoy with this objective. 28 years after the Beijing conference, it's high time. I wish the women in Cyprus full success and full participation. I've met a lot of great women in this country, and I hope that they will be able to say their words also in the politics and in the life of their country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for an excellent speech and for highlighting France's efforts in the context of United Nations to push for a strong agenda and also for asking for sufficient resources, because policies cannot be implemented without sufficient resources. Thank you. I would like now to give the floor to Ambassador Elena Rafti. Elena Rafti is a career diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cyprus. From 2018 to 2022, Mrs. Rafti was the permanent representative of Cyprus to the OSCE in Vienna, and that period I had the chance to work closely with her. At the moment, Mrs. Rafti is the diplomatic advisor to the Minister of Defense. Ambassador Rafti, the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Your Excellency, President of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Cyprus, esteemed First Lady, esteemed Minister of Justice and Public Order, esteemed Chairperson of the House of Parliament Standing Committee on Human Rights and Equal Opportunities, as well as Vice President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, distinguished guests, dear friends. Let me, at the outset, thank Mrs. Haralambidis for this initiative at this moment where we do see a severely turbulent international environment surrounded by many conflicts. The title here of the speech, also taking the cue from a recent debate in the UN, is Women, Peace and Security from Theory to Practice. Historically, women have been excluded or severely underrepresented from formal peace processes, from structures of power, underrepresented in political processes. This applies to most places in the world, and Cyprus, of course, is not excluded from this. In 2000, Landmark Resolution 1325 was adopted on women, peace and security after the advocacy of a strong and diverse, geographically diverse group of member states, as well as civil society organizations, wanted this resolution adopted. The resolution asks states, as the classical subjects of international law, to increase women's participation and to aim for full, equal, and meaningful participation in peacemaking, in conflict prevention, and in peace building. It is structured around the pillars of conflict prevention, participation in peace building, protection of women and girls during conflict, and also looks at women's specific needs in post-conflict resolutions. It also aims to increase especially the participation of women in decision-making and in institutional and resolution mechanisms at the international, regional, and local levels. So the question to ask is, 23 years later, where are we really with the World Women, Peace and Security agenda? There has been a plethora of commitments, of initiatives, of pledges, so certainly we see a shift in the normative framework. But there is also a gap between this normative framework, the commitments and the pledges, and the actual numbers of women included in formal peace arrangements or in the gender provisions that are there in peace arrangements. So it could be a fair assessment to say that the Women, Peace and Security agenda still remains largely descriptive and not yet substantive. It affirms a goal behind which we can all rally. We can accept that there is no sustainable peace and security without women. Women are, after all, a majority of the world's populations. So what can we do to move there? What are the considerations that we can see? What are the problems, the opportunities, the challenges to move ahead with this agenda? I think also it is fair to say that we need to look at some of the assumptions, because some might be uncomfortable thinking that there are binary assumptions here, portraying women as natural peacemakers and women as naturally aggressive or prone to conflict, which of course is a reductive assumption and embedded in assumptions that are problematic and might perpetuate certain assumptions about women and men and about their roles. I think it's fair to say that there isn't sort of a shared womanhood concept that would make us see women, peace and security through the same lens. Our geographic, our ethnic backgrounds, our social and economic opportunities, our implications with power structures, they do condition our perspectives, they do color and filter the way we perceive conflict and peacemaking. So I think it is important to recognize this so as not to perpetuate stereotypes of women's inherently pacifistic nature, to portray women only as victims, and not to see also that women have a tremendous capacity and they are agents of change. And I think there is a lot that is being recognized now, to see women as agents of transformative change. At the same time, when I want to stress this, to move away from this binary perception, we should also understand that, yes, women have and are impacted by conflict disproportionately, often when it comes also to sexual violence, but also to recognize the impact on men, because men are also victims of this. And I think we have to move along and ahead also by taking into account the perspectives of men, by bringing men also on board of this agenda to really be able to effect sustainable and long-lasting change. If you allow me, just to mention a few words on the OSCE, which has been at the forefront of mainstreaming the Women, Peace and Security agenda, of taking a gendered perspective. The OSCE has a strong female leadership in the Secretariat, in missions, in the Parliamentary Assembly, and gender mainstreaming is very important for the OSCE, a declared priority. And this is also included in field missions and field operations, where missions are encouraged and asked to mainstream it in their actions, but also to report, to come back and report on what is done in this field. OSCE member states have devised national action plans also for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Cyprus also has a national action plan. And the effort through these action plans is also to see how the reform in security sector institutions can connect and can align to wider goals, how they can align to a wider agenda. And that could be the agenda of the SDGs, where we have Goal 5 that speaks of gender equality, but also Goal 16 on peace, security, and strong institutions. And we do not have strong democratic institutions if we do not have women's full and meaningful participation in all levels. So the OSCE is making this effort to systematically align and to systematically embed this agenda in all its efforts. Now, when we're talking about the national action plans that we have all adopted, I think it's also fair to point to some of the deficits there. And one is that often there is very low or even non-existing funding for implementing the mechanism of the action plans, or that the language which concerns women representation is vague or not concrete. It doesn't set concrete targets for representations. And I mean, speaking personally here, I think one of the ways really to increase representation when we do face severe underrepresentation is to move ahead with quotas. So we need clear language, we need clear mechanisms, we need funding to be able to move on to effect change. Now, how can we here, and I see so many women and men in this room committed to this, how can we help to effect this change in the Women, Peace and Security agenda? How can networks of women in politics, in defense and security, in mediation, in diplomacy, how can we take on advocacy roles to ensure that there is ownership and buy-in at all levels of government? How to interlink and harmonize with wider agendas of sustainable development, of peace and security? I think we can do this through networks, through advocacy, through mentorship. We also need to start, I think, with a clear assessment of the barriers to women's meaningful participation in political processes. And also this becomes even more difficult, I would say, in the security and defense sector. What are the factors that would allow and enable women's meaningful participation, and what are the barriers? So conducting a barrier assessment is one, and there is, the UN is taking the lead in this and asking member states and asking the defense sector also to conduct such a barrier assessment. It's not necessarily an easy task. It's not necessarily something that is easy to do, but even just to have this assessment, even to have this dialogue institutionally, to have this conversation there, to create awareness, this is going to help the institution. It's going to help not only women, it's going to help men. It's good for the whole of society. So again, I think there's a clear need for us to recognize that barriers affect both men and women, affect society, and we should conduct this assessment in all our institutions that we represent, we could commit. We could commit with our own pledges that we can quantify, that we can set to help others. I think even in countries where women are severely underrepresented, like in Cyprus, we have broken the glass ceilings, and there are many representatives here that show this. It's important to shift also the glass wall. It's important to create a critical mass of women to be able to shift and have a wider debate, because otherwise it will not be enough to really have sustainable change. I mean, in defense, and the Minister of Justice and Public Order alluded to this, that sometimes it's easier to look at security rather than defense, to look at human security. I agree with that. I think it could be an opportunity. The shift to resilience in strategic matters in defense also presents an opportunity for the women, peace and security agenda, because we need also to look at human security. I would also like to have a word of caution or a sobering thought on the many conflicts we face. And we have often seen that when there are conflicts, women's participation can be pushed back. I mean, they could be included in peace processes and then later on marginalized. We could see shifts in ideology, because women's role in nation building is well known to all of us. So, and the reinforcement of patriarchal structures. So this is something that's for all of us to be keen, to be vigilant, to see how we can help with that. So I would just, I wanted to also bring some of the problems here, or some of the challenges. Definitely, we can all work and do more. We have to look at the data also when it comes to participation in different structures and disaggregate the data. Gender data is also something that we need to work on. And again, to come back to the OSCE, that has quite a strong female leadership, also in terms of women ambassadors. There were a lot of networks. Women ambassadors decided to often come together, and again, you know, as agents of our states, of our governments, we had and do have different views, but we could come together in networks to try and advocate for certain things, to advocate the inclusion of certain things on the agenda. And I think perhaps we can also learn from this and see what kind of networks we can also institute here that would push for concrete, quantifiable change, so that we can move on with the women, peace and security agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you for highlighting, Mrs. Rafti, the role of women as agents of change, and for underlining the role of the OSCE in pushing for gender agenda mainstreaming. Thank you so much. And now, it's time to open the floor for the debate. We have already a list of speakers. The speaking time for each speaker is set at 2.5 minutes. You can see the clock on the screens. After that, we will have to move to the next speaker. We will start with Mrs. Erotocritou, who will have the floor for 2.5 minutes, and then she will be followed by Mr. Koukoumaz.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Your Excellency, First Lady. I had a very nice long speech, time to the 2 minutes prepared, but I'm going to put that to the side. And I am sure that none of us disagrees with any of the things that were previously mentioned by all the previous inspirational, if I may say so, speakers. There are two things that I want to put to the table, maybe it will help the discussion going forward. The first one is a matter of quotas. Now, I personally do not agree with quotas, and I would not condone them, and I do not support them. However, as a member of the National Delegation of Cyprus to the Council of Europe, I would like to bring to the table the fact that in the Council of Europe, there is an obligation by the national delegations to have 50% of their own team being women. Otherwise, if the national delegations team is less than 50% women, the national delegation loses its votes in the Parliamentary Assembly. And this is the first point that I would like to make. The second point that I would like to make is something that has been very close to my heart ever since I first got elected in Parliament in 2016. Not only in Cyprus, but mostly in the European parliaments, women, even it is not mentioned, it is not said, however, there is an underlying impression that women in politics, and especially women in the legislature, should mostly accustom themselves and preoccupy themselves with the social framework of policy in the health committees, in social matters. Women are not really at the forefront of foreign policy, defense, geopolitics. And our numbers in these areas are much less than our numbers in all other areas of the legislature. And I think that is something that we should talk about, and maybe that is something that we should push for, and maybe that is something that we should encourage women to take up. What is the men's, it's the men's section of politics, defense, foreign policy, geopolitics, finance, budget, that should be the men's side. And women, we should deal with health, social insurance, pensions, education, but hardcore politics are more apt to the women's mind framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Erotokoudou. And Mrs. Erotokoudou will be followed by Mr. George Koukoumas, who is the Deputy Chairperson of the House of Standing Committee on Human Rights. Please,
Good morning. Allow me to speak in Greek.
Yes, the floor is yours, and then he will be followed by Mr. Christos Senekis.
Good morning, everyone. The first thing I would like to say is that one of the indicators for verifying whether a society is progressing in terms of gender equality is whether we see men speaking about the rights of women. And from what I see of what's happening in this room, there's a long way to go. It is a key point in all discussions evolving around the presence of women in issue and in the issues of security and peace. This resolution 1325, which focuses on a very big truth of human history, that in all wars, women and children, although they are not in the fields, in the battlefields, they are the first victims. Women and children are mostly victims of sexual violence, and when men are out in the battlefield or are being lost in the battlefield, they are the ones that will need to raise the children alone, possibly as refugees. So a big debate is going on about the tangible results of the discussion on this resolution 1325. We would have expected spectacular results, as many member states have introduced national action plans on this resolution. So what has happened in practice is a big question. But there are also some distorted interpretations as to how this resolution should be implemented. There was this idea that if massively women can enter armies, then this is gender equality. But this is not gender equality if women also take part in wars that where the victims are disproportionately women. And of course, I want to say we need many more women, and they will never be enough until they are half in diplomacy, in peace processes, in decision-making centers. But I do have the opinion that gender on itself is not leading to policies of peace. Condoleezza Rice or Madeleine Albright did not have a different policy to that of their male counterparts. So the presence of women in peace and security should be the voice of the millions of women suffering wars. And of course, just very near in our neighborhood, there is a bloodshed and a genocide going on. So in every circumstance, we need to talk about ceasefire and humanitarian ceasefire in order to stop the genocide in our neighborhood. I will give the floor to Mrs. Rita Superman, and this will be followed by Mr. Zanekis. Good morning. Please allow me to adopt the protocol and say that my intervention will be mostly from a sociological perspective. I would like to say that it is clear that women in many ways are being marginalized both during and after conflicts. In this small intervention, short intervention, I will talk about the analysis of conflicts based on gender. The interests of women, the rights of women, and specific priorities of women are rarely taken into account in official peace processes. We must therefore understand the relations, gender relations, and this is a key to resolving armed conflicts and building enduring peace. So we need to shed light on the different experiences of women and men in armed conflicts. And somehow these experiences define the socially constructed concepts of masculinity and femininity, promoting the analysis of gender mainstreaming in conflicts and in peace is a way of understanding and a way of addressing the power dynamics in all stages of peace processes. It is high time for society to start seeing women as agents of change in the peace process and not as vulnerable victims, as we have heard many, many times. Women are not just passive and vulnerable victims. They are also important stakeholders and players in building peace. Women are definitely playing an important role as women, as mothers, activists, teachers, heads of communities, and they have been involved in several activities. However, their role and action are invisible in the context of formal peace processes in most parts of the world. The activities launched by women activists and heads of communities and groups are being carried out outside the formal peace processes. It is in this context that we need to change our attitudes and mindsets. Society must learn that women are effective and should be fully included and participate equally in all decision-making centers in positions that have to do with peace and security. Thank you. Mr. Zanekis, also member of the Standing Committee on Human Rights. The floor is yours for 2.5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This discussion here on a key pillar of a modern society that has to do with the role of women in achieving peace and security is being carried out in the shadows of two wars in our region, Russia and Ukraine, and Israel and Hamas. And unfortunately, the rule is confirmed that the impact of armed conflict is disproportionately higher for women and girls with all forms of abuse that they are suffering. And this is perhaps the main reason for which the parties to war should be promoted to involve women in all these stages, from declaring a war to the negotiations for ceasefires and the peace agreements that will put an end to the conflict and bring things back to normality. Of course, the participation of women at this level in regimes and organizations that are distinguished by fundamentalist and extremism is wishful thinking. In Cyprus, after the tragedy of 1974, the barbaric Turkish invasion and the ongoing occupation of our country, the first successful, I would say, attempt to internationalize the Cyprus problem was with the 4 women's marches. The first march in April 1975 when thousands of displaced women who were still living in tents found the strength to go to the occupied areas and demonstrate to the whole world the violation of their human rights. These marches continued up until 1989, when thousands of women consistently and secretly carried out their plan and entered the occupied village of Achna and went to the church of St. Marina. In this short intervention, I'm not going to reiterate what was said. I want to refer to an American writer, Mr. Stephen Pressfield, who, having studied available literature from ancient Greece, said that Leonidas chose his 300 men not for their own courage, but for the courage of the women. And the reason was that in Thermopylae, in that location, those 300 women were undoubtedly faced with death. And then, of course, it would be the spouses and the sisters and the mothers and the daughters who would have to be strong. And if that was the case, then Greece could be able to defend itself against the Persians. This is why when I see at the checkpoints all these women wearing black and holding the old photos of their missing relatives, I remember Pythagoras and his verses. Daughters, women, young and old, you will be the mothers of freedom. This is from a poem. No more time for Mr. Snekis. So women are not looking for their role in a better world. They have earned their role. It is taken for granted. It is indispensable. But unfortunately, existing political structures are unwilling to adapt to realities. Thank you for your attention.
The Commissioner, European Union Commissioner, Mrs. Vassiliou, the floor is yours for 2.5 minutes, please, and she will be followed by Mrs. Erato-Markoulis.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. It was very interesting. All the, I think, introductory speeches were really very enlightening, and as Mrs. Erato-Markoulis said, nobody would disagree with what we heard. However, let me make a few points. First of all, it was very correctly pointed out that without the involvement of men, we would not achieve the results that we want. The second, also, what Minister of Justice said, making the distinction between security and peace. Well, of course, I disagree with those who make the distinction, because there cannot be security without peace and vice versa. Now, let us be realistic. I think we all wish the same results, but let me give you some details which will make us realize how difficult it is. 15 out of the 16 national dialogues for peace in the recent years were all confined to a small group of men. So you see that it's still far away from our objective. 20% of peace agreements reached, only 20% included reference to gender issues. So the participation of women for peace agreements is very, very important, because our priorities are different. The important issues that we want to make are different from those of men. And finally, let me say that when we say that it is very important for women to participate in the dialogue for peace and peace agreements, their role has to be substantive. It has to be effective. It cannot be just on the sidelines. Be listeners of what the male small group is going to decide. So decision-making should be of essence and substantial. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Vassiliou. Very important points. And Mrs. Erato-Markoulis, the floor is yours for 2.5 minutes. You can use the podium for, okay.
Thank you very much.
They brought you a
Thank you very much, Madam President. I will be very brief. I'm not going to picture a positive situation because globally and as Cyprus, we are not doing well. I will mention what the Secretary General said in May of this year. He said that we will need 300 years until we achieve full gender equality globally. In Cyprus, I think we are not doing well, both at the global level and as compared to other EU member states. Just to mention that as regards parliamentary representation, we are one place before the bottom in the European Union, and instead of progress, we are making, there is a regression compared to previous elections. So we have to realize the situation. We have to realize that there is a lot of work ahead of us. Regarding the negotiating table, regarding peace and security in Cyprus, women's participation is only a recent phenomenon. For many, many decades, women were absent. We have only one woman, Mrs. Stella Sulioti, who was the legal advisor of almost all the presidents, but actual women participation in the negotiating teams is only a very recent phenomenon. I want to welcome the technical committee's paper, common paper and recommendations for a 30% participation of women in the negotiating teams. I would prefer to have a 50%. I'm not happy with the 30%. But there is a commitment of the two leaders, and I do hope that when the two leaders decide about the negotiating teams on both sides, they will stick to their commitment. Regarding solutions, for me, in order to achieve better representation of women, both in the parliament, in the government, and in all these areas, I will disagree with Mrs. Erotocritou. I have been and continue to be in favor of quotas. Countries like France, many other countries, 9 EU member states at this point have adopted quotas, and this is why we have more than 50% of women in governments, more than 50% of women in parliaments. The president of the Parliamentary Assembly who comes from Finland, in Finland, more than 50% of women are in the government and the parliament. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Markouli. But on this specific issue about quotas, I would fully agree with my colleague Christiana Erotocritou, because I think that quotas undermines the women politicians. It's a big debate, yes. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Now, may I give the floor, please, to the High Commissioner of India, Mrs. Hazarika Bhagat, and then she will be followed by Mrs. Rotem Segev, the Counselor Deputy and Head of Mission of the Embassy of Israel.
Dear Chairperson, Excellencies, my dear colleagues, ambassadors here, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Well, first of all, let me thank you for taking this initiative. I think we constantly need these kind of discussions and conferences, and if it happens at the highest level, at the platform of the Parliament, I think it is a very, very positive step. Well, I have a short point to make, which I would like to give it to you as a suggestion, is this, that when I look around the whole hall, I think we are addressing these issues. I mean, all the issues, we know what are the issues, but we are addressing them to a very important component which is not present here. Those are the men. And I think next time when you have a conference like this, at least 50% of the people participating should be men, and men in positions of making decisions. Because I think that all the women present here are aware of the issues and the problems that are being faced by women all over. And also it is very important to take this message to all those men who are making these decisions and sitting in positions of power. I think the awareness has to come more amongst the men, and therefore these kind of conferences and discussions should include majority of men more than majority of women. First point. Second point, I would say in terms of where we take the question of quotas, I think every country is different, the social fabric is different, the circumstances are different. And I would say that we feel very proud at this moment of getting an affirmative action through our Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, who introduced and passed the law in our parliament for 33% of women in the parliament. So I think this kind of affirmative action at a certain point, because every country needs affirmative action. And I think once that is reaffirmed, this kind of quota actually helps the cause of women. And finally, I would say that when we are looking towards solutions, how to bring about more awareness, how to bring about this whole concept of more and more women getting together to understand where the role of women is and how important it is. I think it's high time that we start using the media as an effective vehicle for promoting the cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Thank you. May I give the floor now to the Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of Egypt, Mrs. Maha Shaheen. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I know. Sorry for the mistake. Let me give the floor to Mrs. Shaheen, and then I will come directly to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion today. And as I'm a representative of the Middle East, I want to say that usually we all feel sorry for losing the civilians, and in specific the women. As a diplomat, I feel, and as a mother, I feel to lose civilians in all the parties. I feel losing the civilian on the Israeli side, by the way. We also feel sorry for losing civilians in Palestinian. As the genocide, what happened in Palestinian, not only in Gaza. It is also, Gaza lost like 10,000 during the last months, but Palestinian in general, and also in Ramallah, which they don't have Hamas. And because it is not the appropriate place to discuss the Israeli occupation, I want to highlight the double standard on the political arena. The double standard that the women that they are suffering from the double standard may be on equal foot as the wars and the military conflicts. So from this place, I wish the peace prevails all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you for the intervention. And now, Mrs. Rotem Shegev, Counselor Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of Israel.
Thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity and this stage to share a little bit of my feelings and thoughts from the last month. Yes, it's been a month already. First of all, I would like to thank you for all the support that we received in this room and in Cyprus in general. We appreciate it very much. But here I would like to speak on the names of the victims, on the names of more than 1,400 people who were brutally massacred in Israel on October 7, and especially in the name of the women, that some of the stories you might not have heard. So I'll just bring a few here. Of all the women who were brutally raped for hours by dozens of terrorists while being filmed, and their films of rape were sent to their families. These films are not out because their families are not approving it, but it's out there and we know it. Some of the military officers have seen it, and maybe some others that you've seen in the media. In the names of all the children that were brutally tortured, that their hands got off, that their foot cut off, that their head were decapitated. In the names of all the other kids who were lucky enough not to be murdered or raped, but just to see their parents being brutally murdered from wherever they were sheltering from, either under the bed or a closet for over 14 hours, sometimes babies. In the names of more than 244 hostages that are now being held by Hamas, a terrorist organization, more than 30 children among them, more than 10 of them are under 5 years old. As a mother of 2 babies, I cannot even imagine how it feels like to be a mother of these babies. Or a family member, because some of their babies that they have don't even have parents anymore. They were murdered, along so many others. So in the names of all these victims, I'm calling you, all the women here, to speak up against terror. Stand up and said that these kind of atrocities against women are unacceptable in 2023. Violating women, raping women, torturing women. This cannot happen in our human world if we are to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say that as a politician, as a mother, I cannot see children crying, suffering, being scared, no matter what the ethnicity they are. We have to protect children because they're so innocent and they are children. So please keep the children safe and their mothers. Now, next speaker is Dr. Lavinia Ochia, Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairwoman. I would like to thank you for organizing this important discussion when my colleagues here previously highlighted that conflicts are spreading and are becoming more and more often around the world. Romania, as you may know, is a frontline state of the war of Ukraine and Russia, but I'm not going to talk about this, even though we receive a lot of refugees, mostly women and children. I would like to inform the esteemed guest today about the Women, Peace and Security Focal Points Network Conference, which is starting tomorrow in Bucharest at the Palace of Parliament. The Women, Peace and Security Focal Points Conference was created to assist the member states and the regional organizations to improve and strengthen the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda at the origin of decision-making process. And as a cross-regional forum, the network provides a space to share experiences and best practices to advance the implementation of all Security Council resolution of Women, Peace and Security. The network has more than 100 members, but what I'm highlighting today is that it is co-chaired by Romania and the United States. And Romania and the United States, as 2023 co-chairs, are taking the opportunity to reaffirm the commitment to provide coherence and synergy between the Focal Points Network and to facilitate the substantial mechanism of accomplishing the Women, Peace and Security objectives. But the conference tomorrow, which will start tomorrow, will address 2 critical topics, and one wasn't mentioned yet. It's women in the security sector and women in cybersecurity, both of which are increasingly important in an ever-evolving global and security landscape. The promotion of women in decision-making positions in the field of security and defense will contribute to a more inclusive and safe society for all citizens around the world. And we have to stress that these efforts must include a focus on women effectively participating in peace negotiation, mediation processes, and peacekeeping missions. And here I would like to highlight that Romania is one of the nations who is contributing to the UNFICIP, especially to UNPOL, with a higher number of women. Actually, the majority of them present here in Cyprus are women. Thank you.
Thank you. And we move on to Mrs. Irini Loizidou Nicolaidou, Mrs. Nicolaidou is the Commissioner for Personal Data Protection. Please, Mrs. Nicolaidou.
Thank you, Chair. Allow me many thanks to you personally for this initiative, and of course, many thanks to the keynote speakers for sharing their views on this topic. How can women contribute to international peace and security? For my personal experience, the answer is by building bridges. Building bridges means understanding the cultural, geographical, religious, or any other differences that conflicting parties may have, and attempting to gap them. As member and vice chair of the European Data Protection Board, sometimes I have to build bridges between colleagues who face conflicting perspectives due to such differences. I believe that it was Indira Gandhi who said, "You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist." When peace is threatened by clenched fists, it's our role as women and as persons in office to cool down the conflicting parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And may I give the floor now to Mrs. Emilia Strovolidou from UNCHR. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Madam President of the House, for this excellent initiative. I would like to, on behalf of the UNHCR in Cyprus, I would like to touch upon a very prominent issue that I think is prevalent in all conflict situations, and in situations where refugees, especially women and girls, find themselves when they reach a new country. I would like in particular to refer to gender-based violence. Well, as we all know, Cyprus is a host to refugee community, and that includes women and girls. And some of them have been and continue to be subjected to many forms of gender-based violence. They have been victims of trafficking, they continue to be, some face domestic violence, and they need our protection and our support to heal their traumas and be enabled to stand on their own feet. We do, of course, believe that there has been an increased awareness on these issues and efforts to combat it, including the National Coordinating Body for Preventing and Combating Violence that has been mentioned already. As UNHCR, we have supported the creation of a platform of governmental and non-governmental organizations to discuss those issues, to identify and the needs and the importance of moving forward. Because despite the improvements, we do believe that among the women and girls seeking protection, seeking refugee here in Cyprus, they continue to be at a heightened risk of gender-based violence, and we do believe that it is crucial to strengthen our work with governmental authorities, with NGOs and local authorities through more targeted reception and integration programs. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. May I give the floor now to Mrs. Josie Christodoulou, Commissioner for Gender Equality. Mrs. Christodoulou, for 2.5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would like to note that the UN Resolution 1325, Women in Peace and Security, is implemented by the Office of the Gender Equality Commissioner through a National Action Plan 2021-2025. Unfortunately, I don't have time to present the whole actions and activities that have taken on, but allow me to focus on the participation. But first, allow me to congratulate you, Madam Chair, for the initiative, an initiative which is unfortunately very timely. We are witnessing, we're watching women and children being used as shields of war. Women and children are being kidnapped, have been raped, and have fallen victims of human trafficking for labor and sexual exploitation. but I would like to underline that wars have been historically a male creation and a masculine manifestation. And peace diplomacy is necessary as never, but peace cannot come without women in leadership positions. Therefore, the effective participation of women within the traditional male-dominated sectors where these issues are addressed is crucial. Towards this direction, the President of the Republic, Mr. Nikos Christodoulidis, through his previous role as Minister of Foreign Affairs, took the initiative to mainstream gender in foreign policy, and several actions have been taken, such as the appointment of more women in key positions, including as head of diplomatic missions, and this continues today, where women head the Cyprus missions in Vienna, Geneva, Egypt, Lebanon, amongst others. At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 3 out of 5 directors are women, including the political director, the head of the Secretariat, the General Secretariat of European Affairs, as well as the Chief of State Protocol, and also the directors of both the Minister's Office and the Permanent Secretary Office are women. Ms. Rafti, with her new role, is now the advisor to the Minister of Defense. At the same time, the gender mainstreaming unit that was created within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2020 has now been re-established, and Mr. Gombos has recently appointed Ms. Koula Sofianou as the gender ambassador. I have many more to say on specific actions, but unfortunately I don't have the time to do so.
Thank you so much. And now the floor, Mrs. Maria Savidou Panagiotou, Deputy Director at the Directorate on the Cyprus question. Mrs. Savidou, the floor is yours for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's very timely to follow on the Commissioner's speech that she has referred extensively on the changes in my ministry, but maybe I will take this opportunity to say that 4 out of 6 directors are women, including the director of the Cyprus question, Turkey, sovereign bases and maritime policy directorate, which is huge, Mrs. Rodokritou. The resolution 1325 on women, peace and security is a landmark because it's the first time that the Security Council is focused exclusively on women as members of society that are directly affected by conflict. It recognizes the disproportionate and special impact of conflict on the female population irrespective of age, but also shows the underestimated role of women in peace building and reconstruction following conflict. The case of Cyprus, I think, is very classic on talking about moving from theory to practice. Cyprus has seen other countries that have lived through foreign invasion and occupation or conflict. The contribution of women is determinative for ensuring peaceful living and reconstruction of the social society. The women of Cyprus have suffered and continue to suffer the most severe repercussions of war, while also undertaking a very important part of the weight to heal the wounds and to reconstruct. And I want to take this opportunity that I have the floor, Madam Chair, to pay special tribute to the women of Cyprus. The displaced that has made a new home out of the refugee tent, but continues to claim return to her house. The mother, the daughter, the wife of the missing, that decades after still waits to find out about their fate. The missing women of Cyprus, because there are also missing women of Cyprus. The enclaved Cypriot women in the Karpas, Yalousa, Agia Triada, and Kormakitis, that still sustains the woman of Cyprus, the Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, Armenian, Maronite, or Latin.
Thank you. You have to conclude, please.
I'm sorry. So I just wanted to pay tribute to the women of Cyprus and also say that the women of Cyprus have and continue to play an important role in peace building, maybe a bit more obviously now, but I wanted to also conclude by saying that the implementation of Resolution 1325 is also a priority for the framework of the action plan of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you. Now, unfortunately, I have to, the next speakers, they will only have 2 minutes because we had some add-ons on the list, and we have to conclude in about 15 minutes. So I will give the floor to Mrs. Roula Mavronikola from Socialist Women's Movement, and please, may I have a microphone for Mrs. Dragou here. Thank you. Mrs. Mavronikola, the floor is yours for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I come from the generation where we have lived and experienced the invention of Turkish to Cyprus. We know very well that what it means to be a woman during war. We know very well what it means to be a refugee in your own country. At the same time, being a politician, I was 10 years in this parliament, and in leading positions, I know the difference a woman can make. I could make a list of the different laws and amendments to laws that the few women we are serving to the Cyprus Parliament made, and we still make, so that women can live with dignity and with equal terms with men. Dear friends, we have worked for peace. We have traveled for peace. And we use our position to push for peace, and we will keep working for peace. But believe me, it's not enough. We need more women to work in peace process and discussions. We need the new generation to take the floor. And believe me, when you sit around a table to discuss for peace, you feel the loneliness, because we women, we are very few. And yes, in the time being, we need quotas so that more women can take the floor, more women to sit in a table to discuss for peace. Otherwise, we will be lonely for all our lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Mavronikola. And now the floor goes to Mrs. Steffi Dragou, ex-Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. I will speak in Greek as we have interpretation. So I think that this is very important, because for the first time the participation of women in the peace process is being discussed at a parliamentary committee, and I would like to congratulate you for this. This is an excellent initiative. Very important one indeed. I do hope that with the conclusion of the discussion, the findings and the conclusions will be put into a special resolution that can be put to the plenary for voting, so that when the participation of women will be decided, when the members of the negotiating team will be appointed, we can formally ask for women to take part in that team, because it is a fact that over time in the negotiating process we did not have an adequate number of women, and that has had an impact on the negotiations. And of course, Resolution 1325, which is a landmark for women, is not being implemented. It is high time for this resolution to be respected in Cyprus as well. Today, more than ever before, it is critical for women to join their forces and to demand effective, substantial and meaningful participation in all decision-making centers. Their efforts have been limited to organizations, but I do believe that now the role of your committee and the role of this parliament is truly critical in strengthening the voice of women. It is unacceptable for half of the population to not be represented adequately in the negotiating processes. This is how we can ensure a future for Cyprus that concerns us all.
Committee on Gender Equality. 2 minutes, Mrs. Zavou, the floor is yours.
Please allow me to speak in Greek. The issue we're discussing today is quite relevant to one of the objectives of our technical committee on gender equality. You might know that with Resolution 2587 of the UN, the two leaders were asked back in 2021 to establish an action plan to bring the two communities and women closer. And this was done through the Technical Committee on Gender Equality with many difficulties. We have been able to develop this action plan, which was accepted by the two leaders and was presented in April 2022 at Nicosia Airport. In this resolution, the UN Secretary General asked the two leaders to take action through the technical committee to bring the two communities closer, and this is why the action plan was established. The Secretary General asked specifically for the next negotiating process to have at least 30% participation from women as a first step in this context. And this is why I want to take the floor and announce this before all these distinguished women. Tomorrow at 6 o'clock, we're organizing an event titled Female Leadership. We will have with us a distinguished professor from Harvard Kennedy School, Mrs. Riley Bowles. There is a representative from the Turkish Cypriot community, and Mrs. Natasa Friderikou, also from the Greek Cypriot community, will take part in this meeting. This is an open invitation for all of you, and I will be happy to see you there, and of course, the gentlemen as well. The invitation is open to all of you. Thank you, Mrs. Zavou, and we continue with Mrs. Eleni Evagorou from Boro Women's Movement. 2 minutes for Mrs. Evagorou. Please keep your time. Very briefly, Mrs. Chair, thank you very much for this invitation. We would like to congratulate you for this initiative because it is precisely what we want to highlight as well, that society must be further engaged in this discussion on the participation of women in peace processes. And we must understand what women suffer through war. Unfortunately, this discussion is taking place in the shadow of what's going on in Palestine and Israel. And of course, I cannot but convey what refugees are conveying to us. Palestinian refugees who are seeing from afar women from their country being raped and lost and killed. And I would also like to say that at our movement, we have highlighted that the state should take an initiative to discuss what happened in Cyprus, how women suffered in 1974. We do believe that the women of Cyprus in 1974 deserve a monument in their honor. Women, both Greek and Turkish Cypriots, were raped. They lost their brothers, their partners, their fathers. And for almost 50 years, they're still waiting for the return of their missing beloved ones. So we do believe that society must understand that war is a male-dominated field and recognize what women have suffered through wars. Thank you, Mrs. Evagorou. Mrs. Kalliopi, Agapi Josefidis, 2 minutes for you. Mrs. Josefidis is Assistant Professor, Department of Social and Political Sciences. Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate you for the initiative. Thank you for the invitation. I will be very brief. I would like to raise 3 points. English.
It is on 3 points. The first one is understanding the importance of the gender dimension, because I think it's not well understood. Then is taking stock of the state of the art concerning women participation in decision-making and in the peace process in Cyprus, and then suggesting the framing of a forward-looking strategy. So concerning the gender dimension, when we talk about gender, it's not just about men and women. By scrutinizing gender, both as a constructive element of social relations and also as a signifier of power, as put forward by Joan Scott, we bring attention to the confluences of social relations, to the dynamics of social hierarchies, and to power structures that determine and frame the access to rights. So it's about access to rights. It's not only about men and women, and I think this dimension is somehow overlooked even by many experts. So I wanted to mention it. Then what is happening in Cyprus? I think I will mention only 2 elements. One is our record, and I think Erato mentioned it. We are second from the bottom when it comes to power, access of women to power, which is, there are domains of the AGE index. Power is one of them, and we are at the bottom. And it's our lowest record, so we need to make extra effort. I'm happy that you're here, and all of you are here.
You have to conclude, Mrs. Iossifidou.
Okay,
Thank you.
and the second is what the latest resolution of the Security Council says, is that it regrets the ongoing lack of full, equal and meaningful participation on women in the peace process, and the theory is about 30%.
Thank you.
And then we need to look at the meaningful participation and the role of women, of these 30% women.
Thank you, Mrs.
very much.
Iossifidou. Thank you. Now I give the floor to Mrs. Nadia Kornioti, Associate Lecturer in International and Comparative Law, School of Law. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. May I say that as a citizen, I am particularly happy to be here and have my voice heard. And as an international law expert, I'm particularly happy to be addressing the Standing Committee on Human Rights and Equal Opportunities. I will be brief. There is no need to restate the significance of the gender dimension in peace and security. This has been told for decades now. However, in Cyprus, I would like to point out research that has concluded that the least active group, demographic, regarding the Cyprus problem is young women from the age of 16 to somewhere about 30. And I find this as a point that should be of concern to anyone. In that regard, my recommendations are for more policies that will encourage young girls to contribute and to understand they have a role to play in peace and security, starting from our educational system, and also to more broadly recognize the role of women that women have played in Cyprus so far in order to create the necessary role models and empower those young girls. In the 21st century, we need policies, urgently policies that will address both the challenges and the inexplicable brutality we have been witnessing for the last months and the last years in our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I need a bit of understanding with the time because we are under a lot of pressure. Now may I give the floor to Mrs. Athanasiou from NGO Oxygono.
Thank you very much. I would like to switch on to Greek language.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation to take part in the discussion today. I'm very happy that as Oxygono, we have been asked to take part and represent civil society in this very interesting discussion. Oxygono works mainly towards improving policy generation and participative democracy. For years, we have been engaged in discussions and putting pressure for equality in politics. A month ago, we conducted the 4th Cyprus Forum, where we discuss the architecture of negotiations in the Cyprus issue. Mrs. Drago and Mrs. Markouli have raised this point as well, the fact that the participation of women in the negotiating team for the Cyprus issue over time has been unequal. So we consider that even with quotas, although personally I don't agree with quotas, we should ensure the participation of women in the negotiating team, because as we said, women should have a meaningful participation and a role to play in international peace and security. In addition to that, I feel that we must intensify the role, strengthen the participation of women in international fora, and give women the opportunity to take initiatives and be heard. Mrs. Susanna Pavlou from the Mediterranean Institute of Gender Studies.
I just want to pick up on something that the Minister of Justice mentioned around human security and what security means for women, both in peacetime and what it looks like for women in the context of war. Because violence against women is a continuum, and it doesn't not only happen in the context of conflict and war, but also in times of peace. So human security means very different things when we're talking about women and men. We cannot deplore violence against women and sexual violence after it has already taken place, or when it is our women and girls that are victims in the context of conflict and war. But otherwise turn our eyes from the fact that 1 in 3 women globally are victims of violence against women, sexual violence in their lifetime. Because precisely to answer also something that Ms. Rafti had pointed out, we are not a homogeneous group as women, but one thing we do share is violence, male violence, or the threat of male violence, regardless of ethnicity, race, background, disability, and so on. So if we care about women's bodies and the right to bodily autonomy and integrity, we must do so consistently, systematically, in times of peace, as well as in times of war. And I just want to point out one thing, since we are representing civil society, is Ms. Superman mentioned the invisibility of what women do during times of conflict. And so I want to sort of shout out or sort of highlight what feminist and women's organizations in Israel and the occupied territories at this time have been doing and continue to do on the front line, often to fill in the vacuum in state responses, to support displaced families and to support peace as agents of change, as you quite rightly mentioned.
Thank you, Mrs. Pavlou.
Thank you.
And now Mrs. Evgenia Hamilou, President of the organization Cyprus Youth Diplomacy. For 1.5 minutes, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the floor. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, on behalf of Cyprus Youth Diplomacy, allow me to thank you for the kind invitation. The topic of women, peace and security is a topic that I hold very dear to my heart, both from a theoretical perspective as well as from a practical perspective. But I will be focusing on the practical aspect due to the time constraints. I would like to invite you all to take a look at the Women, Peace and Security agenda in tandem with youth peace and security and civil society participation in terms of the settlement process in Cyprus. In the January 2023 resolution, number 2674, the word youth was mentioned 7 times. And although in the same resolution there has been some discussion about the positive developments on the joint action plan for women, there is still so much to do when it comes to youth inclusion and reaching out to young people. And the Honorable Minister spoke before about the responsibility of remembering the women that got affected, but also protecting and empowering the young women of Cyprus. As such, I would like to hear your thoughts on a possible establishment of a technical committee on youth within the Track 1 peace process to also empower young women And this has been a proposal which has gained momentum both within the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot youth communities. Thank you once again, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Mrs. Hamilou. And now we move on to Mrs. Christina Ioannou from the University of Nicosia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Minister of Justice, First Lady. Allow me to combine my academic background with my experience in the latest negotiating team. Actually, the only woman to be part of the latest negotiating team, even though I'm not pro-quotas, as also the chair is not, same as me. But let me say that women's empowerment and participation is key to peace. And in fact, it's key to everything in our society, not just to peace. But peace is a continuous process. It's not an end point to be reached. Peace must be seen as something that is constantly in the making, as a dynamic process, and including women in peace and in all aspects of society gives it a true impact and a durability. I have a lot to say. I'm not going to say it just for reasons of time, but let me just leave you with this, and it's a very dear quote of mine by Malala. We cannot succeed when half of us are held back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mrs. Monica Pieridou from the Ecological Movement. 1.5 minutes, please.
Grateful for this initiative, Madam President. We are very excited to be part of this. And as Women's Ecological Movement, we cannot justify or accept any form of terrorism or war. And we are in front of many, many conflicts at this time. And I think it was the best time now. It has cost on lives, but on the environment as well. So I was inspired by the women's going and putting their voices up when thousands of them, as Mr. Senekis announced before, and all these marches inspired me and many other women to be activists. I was very young then, but I was following them. And then what I want to say also about peace is I was inspired by these beautiful, simple women that were mothers in their houses, that they tried to bring peace in Ireland 25 years ago. And they succeeded, and they were women. And as in Greek, the word Irini is genus thilikou, it has a female gender. So I'm going then back to say that it's very important to realize the ability of men to realize how women are. When men are asked, we need more women in positions of decision-making, the question is always this. But are they capable? Do they have the credentials? And all,
you have to conclude.
Whereas when men are taking part, nobody asks for anything. And I'm concluding with having awareness about peace and compassion, and women know best.
Thank you. 3 more speakers. Mrs. Naya Gamenu from the University of Cyprus.
I'm going to be super quick. Congrats on the initiative. Many, many thanks for the invitation. I don't want to be misunderstood. So number one, I do agree with everyone who has talked about gender as a relational category, and I also agree with everyone who has highlighted the importance of women's representation. However, in the academic literature, the thorny question is the following. If men cannot or do not represent women, do women can or, do they represent all women? Which brings up the very important issue of intersectionality. And I think we really, really need to think, who are the women who are representing women? We need to acknowledge privilege, color, sexuality, class, and all that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Andri Hadjiandreou from the University of Limassol.
Madam Chair, thank you for the initiative today. Thank you to all the women and the men that are here today. I agree with everyone that has spoken already, so I'm not taking your time. I would like, though, to say that whatever is given to us for free, we are the product. So we need to be very careful when policies are being made for us for free, without us, and without the necessary budget taken into consideration. So I don't need to say anything else. I do agree with the last statement. We need to be very careful about who is representing whom. So once again, thank you, and I'm expecting from this initiative to be continued and developed and to see many more of this in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last speaker, Dr. Katerina Andoniou, lecturer in tourism. Mrs.
Yes.
Andoniou? Yeah.
Thank you very
Please,
much.
the floor is yours.
I'll speak in Greek.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair, for this opportunity to raise some practical suggestions, and this is what I would like to do in brief. I would like to talk about the negotiating processes in the Cyprus issues. How can they involve women by turning towards participatory democracy? This has been done through various tools. We have looked at structured dialogue being widely implemented in the EU. We have seen social mediation being implemented in Cyprus by Ukraine Cyprus and the ICLIM Research Center. Through participatory democracy, we can reach many social groups represented by women and that engage women, and this will answer the question of who is representing whom. Just saying we want more women in the context of the negotiating process is not enough. It is important to find different social groups that will be actually represented geographically from an age perspective, women from the LGBTQ community, from various religious communities and ethnic communities as well. Participatory democracy is part of the pre-election program of President Christodoulidis. So I do consider that as we are at the initial stages of a new negotiating cycle, it is important to do everything we can through participatory progress to broaden the dialogue and include women from all social classes.
List of speakers. I will give 1 minute for concluding remarks to each one of the keynote speakers. Mrs. Rafti, I will start from you.
Or rephrase. Why women in women, peace and security? Not because I think we're inherently more pacifistic.
Okay. You need the microphone, sorry.
Thank you. So, why women, peace and security? Well, no, I would not agree that it's because we're inherently more pacifistic or different to men, but we have traditionally and historically been excluded from power structures, and these conditions our view and gives us another vantage point, which is very, very beneficial to the whole of society with the inclusion. So including women would lead to better outcomes of governance. And when we talked about conflict, things like accountability, respect for international humanitarian law, all of that are always better respected when women form part of the process. On quotas, yes, my personal view is that we do need quotas because of entrenched structures of patriarchy and a replication of these structures of privilege. So we do need a disruption to be able to have more women come on board. And as merit is equally distributed among men, women, ethnic groups, social groups, this would only enlarge the pool of talent. It would make for better outcomes. So thank you.
Thank you. Madam Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much again for allowing me to participate into this debate. I will make 2 points. The big word quota was pronounced several times today. I didn't have a chance to elaborate when I was delivering my speech, but without quotas in France, we would never have achieved the outcomes that I mentioned to you in diplomacy. So 30% of ambassadors now are female. But it's true also in the political life. The political parties are fined in France if they don't suggest or if they don't present list of candidates equal 50% men, 50% women. And it's true also in the private sector. So we have pushed a lot to promote what we call the Women on Board Directive at the European level, and it's to increase the number of women participating into boards of big companies. So I'm not a big fan of quota, but I think they are necessary at one point to break the ceiling. Second point, we all need role models. I didn't have one when I was young in my the closest friends or family, but I was very much inspired by Simone Weil, that you may know, this French woman, survivor of the Holocaust. She became president of the European Parliament. She became a minister several times in France, and she is really a great lady. She entered recently into our pantheon, the place where very famous persons, heads of state are. So I think we all have a role to play to inspire also young women. And I'm trying to do that as much as I can with all the interns. I have one here. So I'm trying to convince them that they can make it, they can become a diplomat, and they can become an ambassador, whatever their background is. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Prokopiou?
Let me first congratulate you, dear Irini, dear friend Irini, dear Madam Chair. Margaret Thatcher was an honorary male. Same doesn't mean equal. So I ascribe to the notion that while women and men are different, and we need to acknowledge that, that doesn't take away anything that has to do with equality between men and women. My second point, and it's a strong point, and it comes from my position as a minister who is responsible for human rights, is a key word which was actually mentioned here, intersectionality. It's not just equality for men and women, it's equality for all. If one person doesn't feel equal, we do not have equality. So my pledge as a minister of this government is to fight for equality for all, under the human rights mandate of my ministry. Two other things which I am personally interested in, and thankfully they are also part of my mandate, is of course gender-based violence. And we did have long talks with Emilia here on including the migrant women and the refugee women who are victims of war. These are the women that we have been talking about today in this present situation, to make sure that we include them in the gender-based equation in our ministry. And the last point, and I see Rita here, who was a pioneer in the field, my ministry is responsible for combating trafficking, victims of war, women. So I just want to end this session with this pledge that as the Minister of Justice and Public Order of this government, I will do the best that I can, not only to implement the mandate that I have in this field, but also to make sure to encourage more women to participate in the security forces on my ministry, and that is, of course, the police, the fire department, and also the prisons department. Thank you very much.
Okay. Amazing women today at the plenary hall of the Cyprus Parliament. And let me add this. I remember a phrase of Madeleine Albright. I always have it in mind, and I keep mentioning it to the different conferences I participate. Madeleine Albright said, there is a place in hell for women who do not support women. So we have to join our voices all together and stand one by the side of the other. Now, I would very much like to thank our keynote speakers, and as a token of our appreciation, you will find a small statue of Astarte next to you. And I would also like to thank the esteemed First Lady, Mrs. Carcera, for honoring us today with your presence here, and all of you exceptional ladies who have so much to contribute to our society. Please carry on with your so important work you are doing, each one of you on a different area. And now, can we take a family photo? Would you like to take a family photo in front of... Can we gather here so we can take a family photo, please? All of you, and then there is a reception, and the staff will show you to the... will guide you out. The family photo.